Hey everybody, welcome back to another social studies lesson for you. Today's lesson is going to be on the Roman military. Last time I talked, I was explaining to you guys a little bit about the Roman legal and justice system and how that kind of influences the U.S. legal and justice systems. Today I want to talk about the Roman military and its impact throughout history because we still feel ripples of it still to this day. In fact, our own military itself, to a degree, is organized the way that the Romans organized their military. So let's talk about that, and we'll jump right in here and get started. So the first thing I want to talk to you guys a little bit about is why Rome was so focused on its military. And if you recall some of the lessons we talked about right before we got into this whole quarantine thing here, we talked about how Rome was not the only group of people on the Italian peninsula, right? There were other groups of people from Greeks in the south to Etruscans in the north, right? And barbarian groups even further out than that. So there were a lot of different people on the Italian peninsula, and the Romans were surrounded essentially by enemies. So they had to carve out their own place, and they had to defend it. And if you recall, the Etruscans actually do take them over for quite a long time. So it's very important for them that once they gained their freedom, once they rebelled from the Etruscans, right, it's very important that they establish themselves as the dominant power. And in order to do that, you have to have a strong military. And it has to be very organized, right? That was one of the things that made the Roman military so successful. It probably was the thing that made the Roman military so successful, was its organization. It is an extremely organized military. And time again throughout history, we see the more organized your military, the more success you have on the battlefield. And that's true. That's still true even still to this day, right? So the military was extremely organized, and on top of that, it was considered extremely honorable to serve in the military, especially in the early Republican days, where a person who was fulfilling their civic duty would serve in the military, right? It was a requirement to serve in the military for all land-owning citizens. And in the beginning, if you didn't own land, you couldn't actually even be in the military. So it was almost, to a degree, exclusive, right? You couldn't get into the military if you didn't meet these certain criteria. And that in itself meant that the Romans who could get in were already seen as being better or in a better spot than the general riffraff of Rome, right? Because they already owned land. So it was comprised of mainly people who were honorable. They owned land. They were fulfilling their civic duty, right? And to be considered the ultimate Roman citizen would be to fulfill that civic duty, right? Another thing, I sent you guys a little bit about Cincinnatus, who was that dictator, right, who fulfilled his civic duties, then as soon as he was done, gave up his power and relinquished it back to the Roman Senate and didn't want anything exchanged, right? He just wanted to serve Rome, and that's the only thing he wanted to do. So he's looked on very favorable in Roman society for this, as the person, the ultimate Roman citizen who just fulfilled his civic duty. So people saw it as an honorable thing to do, especially in the early Republican days, and you were fulfilling your civic duty, right? So let's talk a little bit about the soldiers themselves, right? So a Roman soldier is known as a legionnaire, right? A legionnaire is the backbone of the Roman military. That is the soldier. And legionnaires had a lot of work to do, right? So another question I have up here for you was, what was it like to be a Roman soldier? And that question itself would require a lot of time, which I don't want to go too depth into, but I have a couple things to cover. So first off, in order to be a legionnaire, you had to be able to march. Not just be able to march, but march with all of your equipment on you and extreme distances, right? In a single day, with 80 pounds of equipment or more on, it was expected that you were able to march 20 miles per day. And some accounts have it even closer to 30 miles a day, which from time to time might have been true, but for the most part it was probably roughly around 20 miles per day. But imagine wearing a pack of 80 pounds of gear and marching 20 miles in a day. And that wasn't the end of your day, right? When you got to your next location where you were going to camp for the night, get ready for whatever lies ahead, you had to build a camp. You had to build the entire camp. And a Roman camp wasn't just, you know, makeshift structures, they had entire walls built around their camp. In a single day, they built entire walls and ramparts and towers, and then they would assemble their barracks and their tents, and it was like a mobile city almost. And they were able to do this after marching 20 miles a day. Again, they were very organized. Everybody had a job to do. Everybody fulfilled that job, and that was one of the things that made the Roman military so strong, because it was so organized. Right? There was lots of training involved. You were training on a day-to-day basis, and you had to have a lot of discipline. Discipline was the backbone to the Roman military. They could be very harsh. They could be extremely harsh with their punishments. Two notable stories for you. The first one, it was extremely important that if you were put on watch for the night, you had a fire watch, which meant that you had to make sure that the fire was going, and you had to make sure that the perimeter wasn't being attacked. And if you saw something suspicious, you would call the people to arms to get themselves ready, because you have to be ready for a sneak attack, right? So it was extremely important that the people who were responsible for putting up with guard duty for the night, that they didn't fall asleep, right? Because if they fell asleep, not only did they put themselves in danger, but they put everybody in danger, and that was extremely punishable, right? And so the punishment for this was usually death. It was usually death because you put everybody at risk. You put everybody in danger for it. And they had this bundle of sticks, right, with an axe in the center of it. It was a symbol of power. It still is to this day. I believe it's called a faxes. Right? I think that's how you pronounce it, faxes. But anyways, in the morning, when you report, for duty, essentially, when everybody's lined up in camp and they're taking attendance, you were given something to hold on to during your watch, during your nightly watch, and you had to return that the next day when they called for you for your attendance. And if you couldn't hand that over, and somebody had stolen it from you during the night, because there were people checking on the guards to make sure they weren't asleep, if they had taken that and held on to it, and you were requested to give that back up, and if you didn't have it on your possession, all right, that meant you weren't doing your job. You weren't awake enough. You weren't paying enough attention. Somebody was able to take that from you, and that resulted usually in your death. The person who was holding that bundle of sticks with the axe going through, the faxes, they simply walked around to you and they tapped you on the shoulder with it. And if they tapped you on the shoulder with that faxes, every other legionnaire by you killed you. They essentially they tried and killed you because you put everybody at risk. That was the order. Right? You get in touch with that, the order is you're dead. Right? Another thing that showed the extreme discipline and the harsh punishments for failing to do what was expected of you, your duties. Right? There was a guy, and his name's eluding me at the moment, but what he implemented was something called decimation. Right? Decimation. So it was implemented after Roman legionnaires ran away from the enemy in battle. They retreated without permission, and they ran away. And so after the soldiers got back to camp and everybody was focused again, they called them into their files for essentially attendance, right? And the order was given to decimate, right? And the word for decimation comes from this. And to decimate was literally to take one person out of every 10, and that one person would be beaten to death by their fellow legionnaires. And you had to do this. It could have been anybody. It could have been your friend, and you were required to beat them to death. So that was the punishment for running away from the enemy. And it happened several times throughout Roman history, but it's called decimation, and that's where we get the word from. 1 in every 10 legionnaires were beaten to death for their disobedience and running from the enemy, right? So kind of like drawing sticks. They would put their hand into a leather pouch, and you would have white stones and a black stone. And I believe if you picked the black stone, right, 1 in every 10 was a black stone, that would be you being killed. Pretty sure it was the black stone. Um, next, okay, so that's what it was like to be a Roman soldier. It was a lot of work, right? The good thing about being a Roman soldier, however, is that you got decent food, right? You had some decent food going on. So that's pretty good. They wanted their soldiers to be well fed so that they could fight on the battlefield well. So they enjoyed meals that were better than most. The next thing that made the Roman military so important and so successful was its organization, right? And I have up here some of the things that they did to organize themselves. So the base unit, the smallest unit in the Roman military was called a contubernium, right? And that consisted of 8 men and 2 slaves. All right, so you had 8 people, you were in one tent together, all right, and you essentially lived with these people, you trained with these people for years, for decades in some cases. You lived with them. They became your best friends. They became the only people that you really knew or cared about. And so the Romans found that having these 8 men together with the 2 slaves to serve them, clean up after them, and to pack their things, right? That was the perfect amount of soldiers for them to get a strong bond, to want to fight and risk their lives for each other on the battlefield. All right, they formed extremely strong bonds. All right, and so that was one of the reasons why they organized themselves into groups of 8 with 2 slaves, a total of 10. Right? The next, you would take 10 of the contubernium, and that would equal 1 century. Right? So you'd have 80 men and 20 slaves for a total of 100 people. The thing that is different about the